Hey everybody, we're ready to get going. Thanks for coming on this what turned into a pretty cold, windy, nasty day. How many of you here are in my science communication class right now? I'm just curious to see show of hands. Awesome. If I haven't met you before, maybe stick around a little bit after the discussion today just so I can shake your hand and say hi. I'm Anthony Dudo. I'm an associate professor in the Moody College of Communication, and I'm also the program director for science communication in UT's Center for Media Engagement. And there's Nicole. It is my privilege and honor here to welcome today a close friend and close collaborator of mine, actually, Dr. John Besley. He came down with us from Michigan and brought the weather. Dun, dun, dun.
It's snowing in Michigan. You got nothing.
I don't want to embarrass you too much, but suffice it to say that we're really honored and privileged to have him come down here and catch him before. He's on a sabbatical right now and actually heading to Singapore for 6 months. Pretty soon to be at Nanyang Tech University for a while. And long story short, John is frankly one of the most influential and most highly cited scholars in the subfield of science communication, and he wants to do a little bit of chatting with you today about a research program that actually he and I have been working on for probably nearly 10 years, almost. Maybe?
7? 8?
7?
We're getting there.
I'm rounding up. A really long time.
Yeah.
So I'll turn it over to John and take it away.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for hanging out with me on a cool evening, and I appreciate your willingness to talk about this stuff with me. I'm going to talk about this idea of strategic science communication. Like Anthony, so I moved to Michigan State in 2012, and I think that's about when we started working together, I think in 2011. And I moved to Michigan State. I was at the University of South Carolina, where I was actually doing research on nuclear energy a little bit because they were building the VC summer camp. And there, though, I was in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and I was in the school, actually in the journalism side of that. And I got this gig at Michigan State as an endowed chair in public relations, which was really weird for me because I've never published in a public relations journal. I didn't think of myself as public relations. But the reason that they wanted to hire me, I guess, so they tell me, is that, and I've come to realize over time that essentially I kind of am in the business of public relations for science. But the move actually changed me more than I would have thought. I think it's hard to know what happened because a bunch of things were happening at once. I did the move. Anthony and I, so there's other colleague of ours, a guy named Matt Nisbet, who's another sort of prominent guy in the science comm world, had gotten this data set, the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the big sort of general scientific society in the United States, along with Pew Research Center, which is one of the big sort of nonpartisan polling groups, had done a survey of members of scientists. So normally I've been studying public opinion about science. I started out studying public opinion about genetically modified foods, and then there was a bunch of money, and because a lot of us follow the money, for studying public opinion about nanotechnology. And I moved to South Carolina, and they were building the nuclear plants there, so I started studying nuclear energy, public opinion about nuclear energy, as well as public opinion about science overall. But Pew actually in 2010, did a survey of scientists. And my buddy Matt Nisbet got the data from them because he had worked a little bit with them. And so instead of studying public opinion about science, we had the chance to study scientists' opinions about science communication or about the public, which I just liked the idea of it. I didn't really think it would change really that much about how I think it, but it really did, because what happened then is it got us connected with a whole bunch of funders and a whole bunch of people who, turns out there's like a ton of people, I wish there were more, but there's enough people who are really interested in trying to figure out how to improve the quality of science communication. The one thing is how do we improve the quantity bit, but how do we improve the quality of science communication? And so we got into this sort of gig of, then I'm going to show you some of the data. Since 2011, we had the original AAAS data from Pew, but from there we started collecting our own surveys of scientists, doing interviews with a whole bunch of different groups. So collecting our own data and trying to think through how we could improve the quality of science communication. And because I moved into this PR gig, part of that was coming to think about, and I also do a lot of, in part of that gig, I go to New York, I go to Chicago, I meet with PR shops, bring my students to meet these guys, and starting to think more about what does it mean to be a strategic communicator? What does it mean? What does that mean? And so how do we bring that into the realm of communication research, and particularly the science communication research? And so that's what I study, these two things: public opinion about science, scientists' opinion about the public. We do a lot of survey work with scientists. I do survey work. I work for the National Science Board every 2 years. We write a big report on public opinion about science overall. We still do a lot of that, but the fun stuff I've been doing a lot lately is at the big scale, surveying scientists at scientific societies through different sampling procedures to get sort of national samples. I'm involved in some international projects doing that. Actually small scales too. I work with with long-term ecological research sites to survey scientists in these very specific contexts. And that surveying of scientists and interviewing scientists and trainers has been really interesting. And I actually want to start by talking a little bit, just to lay out is this project there's two projects really that Anthony and I did together. One in 2014 with some NSF money, and then more recently in 2017 with some money from some foundations. I can't remember who now. To do interviews with trainers. So there's this community of people in the US and actually around the world, US, and we did US and Canada is where our focus was, of people who essentially are itinerant trainers. They travel around the country training scientists to communicate. The most popular one is probably the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook. Yeah, of course, yeah, and I think they're recording it and all this too. The Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook, but then another big one is a group called Compass out of Oregon, somewhere on the West Coast. They're sort of distributed. American Association for the Advancement of Science has a big sort of trainer. But then there's all these like smaller trainers. Anyway, so we did these interviews with trainers trying to get a sense of what is it that they're up to. We study science communication, but these people are out there, in theory, training or teaching science communication to scientists. And but most of us, we know among our community of researchers, these people never talk. So we were kind of curious what it is that they were up to. And so what we found was that when you think about science communication training, and this is sort of our biggest concern about science communication training, is most of it focuses on, I'm going to teach this idea that science communication is teaching people to speak clearly, distilling science, translating science. And there's nothing wrong with speaking clearly. I wish I could do it. One day I'll learn. There's nothing, or a lot of it was about storytelling. But our argument is that is not, like if you go, I don't know which direction to point, but if you find the College of Communication here, that is not what people in that building are doing. They're not doing research on how to speak clearly. And so I would argue that that's like a tactic of communication, but it's not the be-all and end-all of science communication. But most of what's going on in science comm training is training for clarity. So part of that means they're not using any social science research. There's a whole community of people who study in colleges of communication who are social scientists, but also in social science, in social psych departments, in political science departments. There's a whole world of people. If you're interested in people, understanding people who are studying things that are specifically related to improving quality of communication. Also, and I mentioned at the front end that so the researchers and the communication trainers don't talk. When we ask the trainers, so what kind of research are you using? They would raise a person here or there. There's a guy named Dan Kahan who does great work on specific cultural cognition, but none of his work is really directly applicable. You can't use it in a sort of to communicate more effectively. We also found that they weren't doing any evaluation efforts. So they're getting paid to come into these communities, come into these universities and do training, but they're not, it's expensive to fly somebody out and do training for a couple of days. Those people who are paying for that are sort of seat of the pants. They're not paying for, in addition, let's do some research about the training. And so the evaluation was essentially, did you enjoy the training? And did you feel like you got better? That was essentially that seems to be the bulk of what goes on for our evaluation. And then the biggest thing for us, which is sort of where we come in, is this idea, all of these things together is, we would argue that it's just not, the way that the science comm training community talks, and the way scientists talk for that matter, isn't how people who do communication for a living talk about communication. And so a part of my goal today is to talk about, and I don't expect to learn, this is more of an outline. I'm going to go through the pieces of this, trying to think about how could we talk about science, how could we help trainers, help people who do communication, think about communication the way that the social science would suggest you might do it. And so the key thing here though is we're going to talk about three main things. We're going to talk about communication goals, we're going to talk about communication tactics, and what I really care about is the stuff in the middle, which is the objectives bit. And so we're going to go through each of these in turn. And actually, it's really important to start with goals. So if you ever hire yourself a PR person, or hire yourself a strategic communicator, and the first question they don't ask you is, so you're putting time into communicating. What is it that you hope will happen as a result of your communication? If they don't ask you that question, maybe, interview another communicator. That should be the thing. That is the thing. But it's not even enough to just ask that. If you just ask that, they could say, if you just take their first answer, that's not cool either. They need to push you and say, well, because I know that when we ask scientists this in interviews and surveys, Like, what's the goal of science communication? What they tell us is, I want people to know this thing, or I want to correct this misunderstanding. I want to fight this disinformation. And what we have to push back and say is, well, okay, cool. Why do you want to fight that disinformation? Why do you want people to know this piece of information? To really push people, it's not enough just to communicate a piece of thing. If we're being strategic, the goal is probably some version of a behavior. And behaviors can be a little bit of a tricky thing. And so this is where we have the picture of a bridge to nowhere, right? Like, if you're just communicating for the sake of communicating, meh. And so the goals thing is a bit tricky. Because when I say it's like behavior, sometimes we can talk about pseudo behaviors. And I go back and forth about how many sort of categories to divide this up into. But I think there's some pretty clear ones. So if you're in the energy space, if you want somebody to buy a more fuel-efficient car, or retrofit, put solar panels on their house, or make some specific individual consumer decision, that's a nice, clear behavioral goal. I want somebody to do this thing. And it could even be more so, I want somebody to call up the installer company for the solar cells. But the idea is there a clear consumer individual behavior? If there's that, awesome. Now we can start thinking like, all right, if that's our goal, now we can build backwards, figure out what we're going to need to do from that. There's some other types of goals which are like more societal, right? Like, if you want government to put money into tax credits, or if you want government to put money into research, put money into research funding, they're kind of like, there are individual behaviors in the sense that you would need individual politicians to make individual choices in terms of votes, in terms of supporting, in terms of putting legislation forward. So there are individual behaviors you need to do, but for the more broader audience, that behavior is sort of more pseudo behavior. It's sort of the support thing. And so there's that kind of behavior. It's kind of a behavior, it's sort of a pseudo behavior. There's another type of behavior which is even weirder, and we were talking about this before, which is there are some behaviors, and I get to this, so I do a lot of work with people who, Michigan State's a big ag school. There are a lot of folks at Michigan State who do develop genetically modified food crops, right? And they have this idea, and I think this is true of nuclear too, where people think that they need to get a lot of support for them. And I would argue that no, you don't actually need support. What you need is non-opposition, right? You need people to not get in the way. You need people not to oppose you. You need people not to write their phone their congressperson, which is a different thing. And that doesn't mean that you have to hide behind a corner. That happens all the time and stuff. If you're a factory in a town, you hire a community relations team to make sure that all the people who live around your plant aren't complaining, right? And that doesn't mean you just like hide in your plant. That means that you're out there every day talking to those people, getting an early notice of any problems that are cropping up. You need to put resources into nothing happening, which is a super weird thing, but it is a thing. So anyways, that's what we mean by goals. And if you're being a strategic communicator, you don't go anywhere. You don't start spending any money until you've really clarified this. I was just in Korea with some neuroscience people and some neuroethicists. And I was brought there to help them develop goals. And actually, what it turned out, I did a terrible job, because what it found out is that they didn't think of themselves as a group. And so they couldn't have a discussion about strategic communication because they didn't think of themselves as a group that had any goals. And so how do you start figuring out where to put resources if you don't know where you're going? And so it was just all falls apart. And so to be able to do any of this, to be able to think about being an effective communicator, the very idea of effectiveness requires you to have effective at what? And at the end of the day, it's goals. Now, goals are hard. They're going to happen. I'm going to talk about how hard they are to happen. Now, there are some people in society that we don't want to have goals. Like, at least not sort of like broad, like these very traditional goals. Judges, journalists, conveners, evaluators, teachers, professors. We don't want people. We want this this neat sort of subset of people in society who we want to manage the process, not to manage the goal. And that's kind of cool too. And so, but the thing about that is that I'm pretty confident from our interviews with scientists that scientists are not these people. Sometimes scientists pretend like to say, oh, I just want to share my science. I don't have any goals. But if you really push them, is that true? I find that scientists do in fact have things that they want to happen. And so we've done surveys. This is a relatively small survey. It's a small survey, but it's a really good sample. It was a random sample of scientists at American Association for University, which is like the 66 big, 62, 60. And so we did this sort of complicated sampling process to get a really nice sample. But essentially what this tells us, and this is consistent, we've done surveys on different samples, we get pretty much the same thing. Enough that we don't really care about the difference too much. But we've always find is that the number one goal that scientists have when they communicate is they want policymakers to consider their evidence. Notice that I don't ask here, I want policymakers to make this decision. We probably could have a question like that that's more about, like it looks closer to advocacy, but at minimum, a behavior that scientists want is policymakers to consider. Consider is kind of a weak verb in terms of goals, but it's still kind of a thing. Ensure cultural values, science, again, that's sort of a little bit of a weak sort of behavior, but it's sort of at that sort of legitimacy level. Getting young people to choose careers, ensure adequate funding. One really weird thing about these numbers is, so what we do is when we give them this, when it's in the survey, it's like a slide, it's a series of sliders that start at 50%, and we say very clearly, not everything can be the most important goal. And no matter what we do, everything's, oh yeah, oh, we're gonna move, they move everything to the right. A few people move everything to the left, and so there are scientists who don't think of themselves as having goals, but for the most part, we think that scientists do have goals. And that's awesome for us, because that means now we can have conversations about, if this is what you want to happen, we can start working backwards to figure out how to make that happen. But let's actually jump to the front end. So tactics. At the front end of things, and this is where most training happens, is what I would think of as, we would call communication tactics. You might, if you didn't like the word tactics, if you felt it a little too mercenary, you might say activities. But these are the things, who says, what do you say, like the message, who says the message, the source. How do you say it, like the tone, the style? Where do you say it? Do you say it online? Do you say it face-to-face? Those are tactical choices, right? Those are things you can, as a scientist, you can choose. You can like, you know what, I'm going to put that person from the lab forward, or that person from the university forward, or I'm going to get them to be like joyful, or I'm going to get them to be serious, or I'm going to get them to be funny, or we can choose all those things to some extent, within reason. There's a whole thing of this, which somewhere on the slide I have an ethics slide, which is like you can't pretend, there's like authenticity still matters here. But generally speaking, there are things you can do. And this is where, again, this is where most of the training is. It's on this sort of tactical level stuff. And you need to be able to do these things. Or at least somebody in your lab. One of the fun discussions in the science comm world is about the degree to which everybody needs to be a good communicator. And I don't think that's true. But somebody that you work with needs to have these skills in addition to the strategy bits. And the other thing we know is we've surveyed scientists about these. We just had a paper come out on this. Scientists are game for almost any tactics, especially, and so when we do these surveys, we don't just do it for the description. We sort of model it out to try to figure out what makes it more or less likely somebody will do a tactic. And what we find is that generally speaking, scientists are more willing to do a tactic if they think it's going to work. We would call that response efficacy, but if they think a tactic works, they're willing to try. Some scientists are even willing to try to be angry and mean. Where's that one? A message questioning the credibility of others. That's sort of right in the midpoint of the scale. Sort of, we have issues. We'll get into that in a different talk. But there's a chunk of people, 10%, put 10% to communication. But they're generally speaking, they're willing to speak in a way that helps connect. They're willing to frame, which is to say, like put something in a context that helps connect with, makes resonate. They're willing to do things to listen to. They're willing to tell stories. Scientists are willing to do a lot of different tactics if they think it would work. But again, what I really care about, and I'm watching the time here, is we started at 5:15, not 5:15. Oh, I was off by, I'm like, how did I already get through 30 minutes? The thing that I really care about is in this black box, and so this is where I love talking about. I love talking about that middle bit, which we will talk about as communication objectives. And this is my building, this isn't Anthony's building, but this is where the people in our building spend their days. This is our happy place. My building looks a little bit evil, but this is where and so one of the things to talk about this is, so I'm going to talk about beliefs. And I don't mean beliefs in like I believe in God. I mean beliefs like I believe the earth is round. I believe that it's cold, that it's warmish in here. I believe that scientists are caring. I believe that scientists are honest. I mean beliefs. But the way that we think about communication, the way that I think about communication at least, is that, so there's two types of ways you can think that people process information. So we can think about the fast ways. So this is Fast and Slow by Kahneman, won a Nobel Prize for essentially changing economics, introducing behavioral economics. He really writes mostly about heuristic processing, system one processing. Heuristic, system one, and peripheral processing. People call it different things. But generally speaking, this idea of a dual mode, two modes of processing. This really quick way that's how we get through the day. If we had to think about everything, we could never get through the day. And so a lot of stuff that we do is sort of this peripheral processing. When I talk to scientists, when I think about science communication, And I should say a lot of advertising works on that space. But when I think of science communication, the stuff that I think people care about and the scientists want to do, they don't want to work at that level. They want to work at this other level. And we often talk about public engagement rather than science communication. And what I think we mean by that is we want a lot of the communication that we do, when we do face-to-face communication, when we just do a nice graphic or something, we're trying to get people to slow down and actually think about something. And what happens when people slow down and actually think about something is they form new beliefs. That's what happens. Or at least you increase the odds that they're going to form new beliefs. Those new beliefs could be beliefs about how science works, the facts or process of science, but it could be a bunch of other things. And it's all those other things that I really, really care about. And the way to think about this, so if you want to get into this, it's just more of a fun version of it. Gladwell's Blink is all about heuristic processing. But you can't talk about heuristic processing without talking about the other thing, which is systematic processing. And so the way that I think communication works actually, especially the science communication that I care about, that I think is the most ethical version of science communication, is that system to central root processing where cumulatively over time people develop beliefs about the world around them. And that to me is that cumulative, and actually that's when we think of an attitude, what we really mean is like the cumulative, for any given subject, it's the salient, most top of mind beliefs that are there. And the other thing about most of the beliefs we care about is they're not like the floor is blue, which is a kind of like not a thing, but it's more like scientists are honest. That's an evaluative belief. And so it already has some affect, some emotion built into it. And so what we thought was an evaluative belief, but those are the beliefs that we really care about. And there's lots of these things. We think this is the ice cream store. You guys have an ice cream store? You guys aren't in ag school. You guys probably, you guys don't have, do you have your own ice cream? No, you guys, oh, I'm sorry. Michigan State has its own ice cream. We have wonderful flavors. But there's a whole bunch of them, right?
We have queso?
Yeah. I mean, but you don't have there's not like a UT ice cream. You don't have like a whole, no, you guys don't have your own cows. We have our own cow. You guys have a whole cow. You think you guys should get some ice cream. We have our own ice cream. There's lots of different flavors of ice cream, lots of different beliefs that go along that we can talk about. And so these are the beliefs that were in the middle there, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. This is the big picture. So we're going to talk a little bit in the time we have just about some of the ones that I really want to emphasize. And so the first one is the factual knowledge awareness beliefs, that factual knowledge bit, which sometimes you could think of as science literacy, science learning. It's a wonderful thing. So I was on a National Academy of Sciences, which is committee a couple of years ago, where we were asked to look into, there's sort of this idea, the fundamental challenge in science comm is this idea that if I just teach people stuff, they're going to do the thing, they're going to have the attitudes and behaviors that I want them to do. If I just get them the right facts, I've got to figure out what the right facts are, but if I just teach them the right thing, they're going to, and this is the challenge, that it turns out that isn't true. What is today? Today is not Valentine's. So I gave this talk once on Valentine's Day, and I sort of equate this. So imagine you're going on a date, and rather than like trying to be on your best behavior, which you just gave like a fact sheet about yourself. Here are the 10 things that are, like, that's just not, it's not going to work out for you, probably. I mean, maybe it will. I don't know. Never tried it. But it's not enough, right? So the facts aren't going to be enough most of the time. And so, and I mentioned that communication is not translation to stuff. You think about this, imagine if somebody just understood, if I go to another country and if somebody just understood what I was saying, surely they would love me. Right? That's not, no. I mean, it matters what you say, too. It matters the beliefs that they form in response to you. And this is not to say that science communication isn't sharing stuff. I think of sharing the knowledge. We're so privileged. I feel so lucky and we're so privileged, a lot of us, to work in universities, to be able to do research, to be able to find out new things, to spend our life. Like, it's just a cool deal. We're kind of a lucky people. And so, but the thing is, people want access to that, right? So the knowledge that we have the privilege of earning is, to my mind, the ticket into the room. That's why people invite us to DC, why people invite us to Texas, to give talks, to do these things. And so we're going to always share the knowledge and the stuff. But the point is that that's not all communication is. There's other stuff. The ones that I have to admit I care most about, because mostly I'm interested in the social psychology of trust or fairness, is that one of the things that you do when you communicate is I can purposefully communicate things about me and my field, ultimately. So for example, one of the things that you can communicate is, do people perceive you as warm and caring? Right? Do they perceive that you're in this for yourself, or do they perceive that you're in it for the community, for the group? Right? And so the trick with that is it doesn't just happen, right? And so usually when I do training, what I'll do is, all right, so imagine, actually I don't have that one here, but so imagine that your objective, and we're a little bit pedantic about this objectives versus goal. You can say short-term goals, long-term goals, but So if your objectives is like, one of the priorities that I have is to make sure that you perceive me as warm and caring. If I make that my objective, now we can start talking about tactics, right? We say, well, what would you do if you were giving a talk and you wanted people to perceive you as warm and caring about the community that you're communicating with? What would you do? What would be a tactic?
Ask them about themselves a little.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, jump that. Yeah, ask them about themselves?
Yeah.
What else? So you.
Community and,
Yep.
kind of bring that.
Yeah, and so I would put that in, so there's another one there, which is willingness to listen bit. And so I sort of, the openness, willingness to listen. One of the problem with these is they're super highly correlated. Like, it's hard to be perceived as willing to listen and not caring. You can imagine that's the case. I sometimes use the example of a plumber. So you can imagine a plumber, and did I do this yet? Did I do the plumber? I did the plumber yesterday. So imagine you have a plumber, right? You want the plumber to be competent, right? So that's a good thing. But you also want your plumber. It's a little bit delicate. Yeah, so what was I talking about? Oh, the plumber. So if you're a plumber, you want people to see you as competent. That's relatively straightforward. But if you want people to see you as warm, you got to do some other stuff, right? You have to be nice. You have to be friendly. If you want people to perceive that you're listening, you have to talk about what are the things that what's your problem? What's not working? How can I help you? There's things you can do in that space. I once gave this talk to a group of people and said, gotta give people hugs when they show up. Like, that's not what I'm talking about when we're talking about warmth. I mean, maybe that's appropriate, but mostly it's not. But there's things, so show up early. So the one that I actually have to admit, I love trust stuff, but the trust bit I love the most actually is that willingness to listen, openness one. Because that's where so many great tactics come in. Show up early, stay late, right? Talk to the people who are organizing it. When we're like, so who's coming? What are they interested in? What's their goals? What do they want out of this? What if I want to do shared beliefs, right? If I prioritize being like, I want you guys to think that I'm like you. So I talked a little bit about doing energy research. I talked a little bit, and it can start to feel manipulative, but at the same time, if it's true, one of the things is prioritizing it, right? So if you don't, these things, like if you want people to believe that you're caring, you can't just hope for the best. You can't just hope that they're like, oh, I hope I come off as caring. You got to actually make sure, it's your responsibility as a communicator to make sure that happens. Actually, so I've been looking, I just gave a talk somewhere else on trust, and I've come to think, so I really care about the willingness, openness bit, but it turns out for the scientific community, this integrity bit is really tricky. When it comes to like sources of funding and stuff, if you look at the trust data, so Pew Research Center just collected a whole bunch of trust data. There's a group called the Wellcome Trust Foundation out of the UK just did this crazy survey of 120 countries, 1,000 people in each country about science and a lot of questions about trust. And the place where scientists do the least well is on the integrity question. People really worry about where we're getting our money from. And so if you want people to perceive you as having integrity, as being honest, as being moral, you got to talk. You might have to take, if you have 60 minutes, you might have to spend 3 of those minutes, 4 of those minutes, some proportion of those minutes talking about those things. You can't because one of the things is, just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean people aren't going to develop these beliefs or make these judgments. Like, people are making these judgments all the time. They're going to use the information that they have to make those judgments. And so the question as a strategic communicator is, if it's important to you, so let's say you do this formative research, you do some research ahead of time, and you find out that they're kind of a little bit worried that maybe you're biased because you're getting money from industry, maybe you need to spend time then allaying those concerns or trying to allay those concerns, or at least recognizing and acknowledging those concerns. People are going to make these judgments no matter what, and so you have to help them out. So I really care deeply about those we kind of call them relational objectives, trust objectives, but there's other stuff too. And so, in fact, there's 3 of these. We talked a little bit about knowledge. There's a whole bunch of objectives that aren't really in the belief category, particularly things around interest or affect, emotion kind of stuff, or particularly like discrete emotions, disgust, fear, hope, joy. There's things like that you can try to communicate. I'm a little less comfortable with those in terms of science comm. I think it's great sometimes with kids, particularly a lot of the people who I work with who do stuff at museums really care deeply about they really care deeply about the identity belief objective, but also the getting kids excited about things. And that's great. I start to worry a little bit about that when we start dealing with adult audiences. But sometimes, like if you're talking about funding for some new technology, I think it's okay. If you genuinely are excited about it, I think it's probably okay to share your excitement. If you genuinely are joyful about your research, then I hope you share that joy. I think research is pretty cool. So there's those things. There's also some framing things that I don't tend to talk about. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but that's like things like, do I talk about, classic one, it's like I'm trying to get somebody to wear sunscreen. Do I talk about it as a way of preventing cancer? So a prevention, like a gain, or sort of a, or do I talk about it as a loss thing? To keep my skin, gain thing, keep my skin nice and whatever, or do I a loss thing, preventing cancer? Do I talk half full, half empty kind of stuff? Or even that's sort of at a psychological level, or you could do it at a sociological level, which is like, do I talk about climate change as a health issue, an environmental issue, a national defense issue, an industrial, like an economic issue? Like you can talk about climate change, you know, if you're dealing with, so there was a hypothesis that people put forward, for example, that if you're talking to conservatives about climate change, don't talk about it as an environmental issue, talk about it as a national defense issue. You know, it turns out the people who are spending a lot of money dealing with energy stuff, of course, you guys, I'm sure you all know, is the military, because they don't like trucking gas across the desert. So they're really interested in lots of energy things, right? So you can talk, it turns out they tried that in some friends tried that in some experiments. It actually kind of backfired a little bit. It turned out it kind of pissed off the conservatives because it seemed a little manipulative. But it turned out if you're talking about climate change in terms of health, in terms of diseases moving, that was a little more resonant with a broader range of people. And so some of this too is being strategic, is also about being evidence-based, thinking like you have a hypothesis. I think it might make sense to talk about climate change as a national defense issue, and you try it in some sort of constrained setting, see if it works, and if it doesn't, step back and say, well, what might work better? Or even if it does work, maybe something else works better. So thinking about it as sort of like a series of, thinking about science communication as the series of experiments that you're trying, especially if you can, you know, get people like Anthony to help you actually do it as experiments. But that's sort of the framing space. It's not my area of expertise. But there's other ones I do want to make sure that we talk about these other three, which is, so these are the sort of the classic, once you know a behavior you want to happen, we have social sciences, lots of research on how to change behaviors, particularly behaviors that are planned, behaviors that are like not habitual behaviors, but behaviors we do on purpose. So the classic thing, of course, and I think this is probably one thing that is in a lot of training, is just talking about risks and benefits, risk and benefit beliefs. Those aren't the same as science beliefs, like here's how nuclear energy works is different than, you know, nuclear energy has benefits, you know, environmental benefits, health benefits, economic benefits. Those are different types of messages. And so, actually, in fact, in the nuclear space, the friends out of Switzerland showed pretty clearly that benefit messages were actually more powerful than risk messages. That, you know, actually benefit perceptions, were more powerful in terms of support than risk perceptions, and so therefore risk messages. But we can do that. And so the Compass is a really good group of trainers, I said, out of the West Coast. And they have this nice sort of tool, for example, that helps people think about what are the benefits of the research. And of course, if you're doing National Science Foundation things and you're talking about broader impacts, you can get into that benefit stuff. And of course, there's lots of discussions at the national level about being a little more clear about when we're asking for money for our research about our benefits. And there's some tricky things around that, but I think generally speaking, when we're talking about our research, and if there are benefits, finding a way to talk about those benefits in a really clear way is not a bad thing. Figuring out what benefits people care about, figuring out the degree to which we can talk about those. But it's not that, that's everybody, that's almost a pretty common one. A little less common, do you guys have this? So is our norms-based campaign. So this is a version, we have these ads run around campus all the time. This is the MSU Ducks. This is called a descriptive norms campaign. So it says 9 out of 10 MSU students either drink moderately or do not drink on NCAA tournament days. It turns out we have a bit of a problem on campus that students get drunk and burn couches occasionally. And so they're trying to get people to do that less.
Nothing like that ever happened.
No, I'm sure you guys are much Michiganders. What are you going to do? But so one interesting thing about drinking norms is the thing that you see are the kids who are actually out stumbling about the streets. You don't actually see the people who are back in their back at the library, back in their house, doing their studies, doing the reading, or just hanging out, being calm and cool, collected. And so there's this potential for people to develop for people to see the drinking bit as normal, because that's what you see, it's what's visible, right? And so one of the argument in this sort of type of campaign is to try to correct incorrect norms, or sometimes people don't know what the norm is. I find this often in my faculty job is I don't know what grades my colleagues are giving, and so it's hard. I want to give a grade that's similar, like an average grade that's similar to my colleagues, but unless I know what my colleagues are giving, that's really hard to do. And so if you want, and students probably don't want this to happen, but if we don't want grade inflation, we need to and so we need to communicate the norms. And so this turns out to be a sort of a pretty common campaign. There's two types of norms. There's what people are doing, and that's a descriptive norm, or a subjective norm, which is what people want to happen, what do your peers want you to happen. And sometimes in communication, you need to communicate those things. We found this, I was doing this research when I was at University of South Carolina, in this environmental dorm, where everybody cared about the environment, but nobody talked about the environment, so nobody knew what their friends cared about the environment. So they didn't know that their friends were doing these steps to save energy. They just didn't know about that, because nobody ever talked about it. And so the argument would be, and we never got to test it, but the argument would be, like, if people don't know what the norm is, you need to correct it. In fact, so the classic research on this is a guy named Robert Cialdini, who did stuff like putting signs in hotel rooms that would say, 80% of people who stayed in this hotel room used their towels on more than one time, right? And they found that actually message was a lot better than even 80% of people in this hotel, or 80% of Americans, right? That they could get that norm closer to people, that they could change people's environmental behavior. They did similar work with energy bills. And there's been some backfiring effects too, where people call social licensing, where like, oh, everybody else in my neighborhood is using less energy than me, I can turn up the heat or something. But the idea is that we can change people's behavior sometimes by communicating norms rather than the science, or rather than other things. And the last one I want to mention is, again, this is the one where I want to do more research. I haven't done as much now, but what we would call efficacy beliefs. It turns out for most of our, when we talk to scientists about tactics or goals or objectives, what we find is that they will do those things. They will do, particularly tactics and objectives, that they will do those objectives if they think it works. And to us, that would be a response efficacy message, right? If you think something works, you're more likely to do it. If you think some step is going to, or the climate change research shows that if you think that some behavior is going to help deal with climate change, you're more supportive of that behavior. There's a subset of that probably some of you have seen, which is, and it's kind of somewhere between it's kind of a norm thing, but here a consensus message. Here's what scientists think will work, kind of thing. And so it's using this scientific consensus plus an efficacy message to communicate this thing will work, and so they're combining these things. But there's this idea that if I just communicate, if you do it, it'll work. That tends to be, and here's how it'll work. Here's what will make it more likely to work. Then there's a separate side, that's the response efficacy. There's a separate side of efficacy, and this is often in the smoking, if you see this now in a lot of the smoking campaigns, where everybody knows that smoking's bad for them. Everybody knows that their friends want them to quit smoking for the most part. But people don't feel like they can quit smoking, right? And so that's like, they don't feel like they have the personal ability or capacity to do it. And so if you want people to stop smoking, what you need to do is increase that self-efficacy, that belief that they can make the behavior change that they want to do. And that takes like, you can do it, we can help. I think that's the Home Depot message. But you can, but that takes time to improve people's sense that they're able to conquer a problem is, again, that's a thing that we have to decide to do. And you have to do that formative research to figure out, is the problem that they don't feel like they can do it? There's another version of this, which is like, if you want, I found this in studying public meetings, people might say, I can't come to the public meeting because somebody has to take care of my kids, right? So they're saying that I want to do this thing, but I can't. And so if we can do a procedural thing, which is, yeah, no problem, we got childcare here for you. We take away that reason why they feel like they can't do something. And so we can sometimes do, and so one of the things about communication is not all communication is like a message. Sometimes it's a behavior or a process. I can put something in place that takes away or creates, and then, yeah, that's. And what we find with this, again, we do surveys of scientists, we find that scientists are willing to prioritize lots of different objectives. The objective that they do the most is that sort of classic informing people, but they're willing to do excitement type things. They're willing to do, talk about what they're, try to make sure that people believe that they're caring. Try to make sure that people are seen as, scientists are seen as open and transparent. But one of the other things we know about this is the different question we ask is, prior to this survey, have you ever thought about, how much have you thought about these objectives? And the answer is, not really. They've thought about knowledge transfer as an objective. A lot of us are instructors, but they haven't thought about all these other types of, all these other ice cream flavors that they could try to, all these other beliefs that they could try to change. And so part of our gig in this is trying to expand the pantry, expand the range of potential communication objectives that you could pursue. And yeah, and the fun things about this is if you're really clear about those objectives, they're actually perfectly measurable. If you say, my objective is to be perceived as warm, I can now ask the audience, did you see me as warm? If my objective was to be perceived as having integrity, I can ask the audience, did I have integrity? Or you can ask in a community sense, does this organization seem like it has integrity? And so the nice thing about being really clear about objectives is it starts to give us really good way to evaluate. It also clarifies what it is that we're doing. So one of the big things in Science Comm is dialogue. We need to have dialogue. So what is it about dialogue? Dialogue's a tactic. We need to have discussions. Well, the cool thing about dialogue is that it's a technology that gives us the opportunity to interact with people directly, which gives us the opportunity to be open. It gives us the opportunity to be warm. It gives us the opportunity to demonstrate our integrity. It gives us the opportunity to give people a sense of self-efficacy. We can start thinking about, like, given the tactics, storytelling is the same way, that we can start thinking about why is it that certain tactics are so powerful? Because they have these effects on the beliefs that we care about, or the way people frame things, or the emotions people feel. Yeah, I do worry about a lot of this in terms of, like, you do a lot of these things. If you try to pretend that you're warm or convince people that you're warm and caring and you're not, that's not good. If you try to pretend you're listening and you're not really listening, turns out people are actually in the short term you might trick people, but in the long term I fundamentally believe that people will figure you out and it'll be worse. And so I'm no way suggesting anything other than if you want to be perceived as willing to listen, find ways to listen. And then communicate that you're listening too. Can't do everything though. It's a big candy store, there's lots of choices. Got to make choices, and so part of that choice is I've talked before about, I mentioned in passing, like you do formative research, figure out where you're low, figure out what beliefs are correlated or associated with the behavior you want. You got to do that, work with some people who have we have theories that try to connect the objectives to goals or to behaviors. You got to do that work, that hard work to figure out what to prioritize. And, I'm pressing the wrong direction. Oh no. Yeah, all this to say, takes time. There's nothing magical about communication. It's a cumulative, remember I mentioned cumulative effects. These things take time. Got to be clear about everything, tactics, objective, goals. I should say that, and I haven't figured out a way to integrate number 4 there into it, but I will say that part of being an ethical communicator is you need to be open to changing too, right? If you're willing to listen, that means you're willing to have your own beliefs changed, your own beliefs about your efficacy, your own beliefs about is the audience honest, integrity, knowledgeable. So your own beliefs have to be open to changing too. And the other thing is that we're all kind of in this together. So if we as a community prioritize being seen as honest, and then some less honest person goes out there and starts doing stuff, that affects all of us. If we say like we want to be perceived as a group of people who care about society, and we have people out scientists out yelling at people, those things kind of affect all of us. People make judgments from the individual to the group, and so it's a tricky thing. We're sort of in this together, and so part of being strategic isn't just about individual scientists. It's about how do we come together to set goals that not just for our individual labs, for our universities, for our colleges, for the community of science in general. And I will stop there. And thank you very much for letting me chat about this stuff. I only broke one microphone.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, so I think what I'll do is just kind of run around and give the mic to folks who may want to talk to you or ask a question.
Apparently.
Something like that.
So you guys can share. You can do one aisle and you can do the other.
You hang out over here and I'll go hang out over here. So who'd like to ask a question or share a comment or anything like that?
On now.
Figure out, let some of your students.
I'm happy to answer. Like, don't feel bad. I love talking about this stuff. I feel very fortunate to be able to study this stuff. So,
Well, in our real world here, applying all your research, the social science research and so on. I know that a number of universities are doing that. Yale and Georgetown all have climate centers and climate communication centers. And so I know they're trying to help people learn how to communicate. Well, I mean, really the subtext here for a lot of us, and I have an agenda. I like the way you talk about, trying to be neutral and ethical and all that, but my agenda is, say, climate change. And trying to, my goal would be to get people to, policymakers and people who vote for them, to vote for policymakers that will support climate change research and so on. So I guess my question to you at the moment would be, how would you apply all this? I have a climate change slideshow that I give largely at retirement centers and to some small young student groups. And so when I run into, pushback basically, and there's always pushback in the audience saying, climate change is not real, or maybe it's real, but it's not human, of human origin and so on. Can you comment on how this research?
I would be curious to know what tactic what's your tactic? What's your go-to?
Well, that's a good question, and I've never thought of it. It's funny you asked them what if they've thought about their tactics, and most of them said no, so I don't think consciously about what my tactic is, except for that I know that when I go in front of a group of people, that there's going to be a mix in that group. There's going to be people that go, we're with you, and there's going to be others that say, you're wrong, you're in denial, and so on. So I try to take that into account because I don't want an ugly confrontation and so on. So my tactic is to, in the slideshow that I give, I try to, for instance, I try to engage the fact that fossil fuels got us where we are. That if it wasn't for fossil fuels, that we wouldn't have the civilization we have. It's just now we've found that they're toxic to a number of systems, economic, social, environmental. So I try to give the other side, I try to preempt their argument.
Two-sided arguments. We know from the persuasion literature, two-sided arguments are recognition of the other side as an important part of preventing counter-arguing. So the fundamental thing is, there's a couple ways to think about it. So one, there's thinking about, so if you have let's imagine you have a room of 100 people, right? There's going to be, let's say there's 25 people in that room who are you're never going to reach, right? And there's 25 of the people who already love you and are already committed. And so let's say now we have 50 people in the middle who are people that are open to having beliefs, their beliefs change. Now we can think, well, so if I'm a jerk to that 25 who don't, so they're watching, right? So the part of the big thing is like, well, recognizing that I'm trying not to antagonize this group. I'm trying to, but I have this group that I can reach, and they know they're watching me how I interact with these people, and hoping that these other people aren't. Sometimes I worry about the 25 supporters might be like pushing you harder and trying to get you to be a little, but avoiding that like getting goaded, and like remain like and then. Also that long-term, like no, and then I think it's great that you're thinking about those sort of sometimes less reached communities. And the other thing is to think about, because of this cumulative, is like you don't have to get them in that moment, right? The goal isn't in that room. A lot of the training that we see, it's like it feels like they're trying to get. It's almost like they're training evangelicals like to convert somebody in that moment. Right, and so it's not. You're not doing that. You're just trying to like if you can just think about like a few positive beliefs that go towards you, towards the side that you care about, that's a win, right? And recognizing that the cumulative thing over time, that's how we get there. Unfortunately, climate change, the thing that is frustrating about climate change is we don't have that much time, and so it's hard to know. But for the life of me, I've never seen any evidence that being an asshole is particularly effective as a communication strategy. Though we have lots of science communicators who that's the go-to, because it makes that 25% of that 25 people will like get right behind you, and you'll feel great, and they'll say all kinds of nice things about you on Twitter. But if we're being strategic, we're thinking about who are the people that I can actually, what are the beliefs that I can actually move? Another thing on the climate change front, I think, is to some extent, I think in some of the communities where they're making progress, they don't even talk about climate change, right? The climate change, it's get them to do the behavior I want. buy the green car, retrofit the community home, the citizen center, because that has other benefits, right? And so don't worry, like it's not, there's a discussion like, well, why do I need them to support climate change, that climate change is real? I don't need them to support that. I just need them to take the steps, to be supportive or not get in the way of the steps that I need to happen. And so then I can work on that space. And so, yeah, like we don't, I find this in the evolution, some of my evolution colleagues, where they really feel like everybody has to believe in evolution. Like, do they? I mean, yes, that's great, and if you're doing research, but like, is that where you want to spend your time trying to convince people? Like, what is it that you want to happen? And then it may be that people believing in climate change isn't necessary for that to happen, but that they do want that their vacation homes aren't submerged, and so they need to put money into mitigation efforts and whatever. Or they don't like traffic jams, and so so if you can find those things that they actually want and talk about policy, then there's something in that space that I think I have to admit I've stayed out of the climate change one because the other part I guess is not politicizing stuff, like not doing things recognizing, not lying about who you are, but not making it. So one of the arguments is that one of the things that happened in climate change is Al Gore was exactly the wrong person to push it, right? That wasn't strategic. It shouldn't have been him. And so but it's how do we pull that, like that sort of, it's out of the cage now, so how do we pull it back is really hard. Yeah, I mean, there's
regarding the defense department.
yeah, I love
The Defense Department has issued a whole slew of reports because they have bases out on islands in the Pacific Ocean, Guam and so on, where they are getting flooded, Norfolk and Virginia. So they're on board with climate change. You know who else is, of course, is insurance companies.
Sure, yeah.
They're huge on climate change. So talking about just the real world applications of the concern rather than getting into politics.
And and things that are wins for everybody. I mean, I don't know that we need, but it's tricky because there are political forces that do want to pick fights, and there are reasons that people pick fights, and I have to convince myself not to pick fights, and so it's hard. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it, I suppose. What else we got? Oh, there's.
So we're in a time now where like anyone can put their opinions online, and there are studies that have shown that the like tweets and like posts that get the most engagement are use like outrage and like really moral language. And so I'm wondering how you think that plays into scientific communication and whether it's like a good or bad shift.
So this is where we go to the we're all in this together bit, is I can't figure out how that helps us. As a community of science, I can't figure out how. So sometimes I use the example of like election campaigns. We're like, so there's the people you raise money from, right? Again, this is like the 50, 75, 25, 20. There's people you raise money from, and then there's people that you're trying to get to vote for you or to get. And you can and you can make, and ultimately people you make money off of. And so there's a way of stoking that, and of course our media system is set up right now. So the other part of that is, and this is sort of the, you can only control the things you can control. And the things we can control as a scientific community are our own behaviors, the behavior of the people around us. And the hope is that cumulatively, if we individually and in the groups that we have control, have power within, we make the right choices, then we can sort of move those norms. It's like, again, we can control the things we can control. We were talking about this yesterday, that I haven't figured out necessarily how to do that, because like I follow all these Facebook groups and Twitter feeds where people are being jerks. And I want to say like, hey, is that helping? But I know if I say, hey, is that helping, they'll attack me. People don't like being told. I mean, it's hard to tell somebody they're a jerk without being a jerk. It's a real conundrum. And so finding those ways to through your own positive. But the fun thing, I'm also part of a community of science comm people who are so positive and who are so, be the change you want to. I feel like a postcard. Be the change you want to be. But that's what we got. And find the people that are awesome and support them and put and give them the likes and give them the platforms. There's a thing about when we think about science comm. One of the challenging things is people can self-identify. I am now the spokesperson for science, and we don't. And we can't do anything about that. One of the wonderful things about science is that we're pretty free to make choices for ourselves. But what we can control is the people that we do want to be the front people of science. We can put, and we want that to be diverse. We want that to be, all the great voices a range of voices that we can have. We can put resources behind them as a community, right? We can put it means we can write money into our resources, into our grants to make sure that we're putting people forward. We can make sure that our scientific societies have programs in place that put those people forward. We can do things to put the positive voices forward if we choose to, and if we prioritize it.
I wish we could bring Carl Sagan.
Yeah, he was good.
I don't know how it would fit into how he would go up.
But the thing is, this thing is not thinking about going up against him, but thinking about parallel tracks. And
Well,
I mean,
but you get these other,
Yeah.
like some of the other speakers these days.
we have the Dawkins. Dawkins is kind of tough. It's a little bit tough. Even so, Neil deGrasse Tyson can get a little punchy. Bill Nye gets a little punchy now.
Right.
I mean, you think about these guys. I mean, so the empathetic way to think about these guys is always think about what they're dealing with, right? They're facing, and even your Michael Manns and stuff, like they're facing really tough stuff every day. And so
Death threats, really.
death threats and just people saying terrible things about them. And I mean, so maybe that the resources we need to put in support, counseling resources for the people we put forward too. But on the other hand, we have our Catherine Hayhoes, right, who somehow managed to maintain that,
She comes out and says she's a Christian.
She can, but she still gets attacked, right? She still has people who are attacking her, and she still somehow, through force of character and awesomeness, keeps the positive message. And I just, again, I go back and I think I've scoured the literature and had a PhD student who did a dissertation on this. I can't find any evidence that being a jerk works. It just doesn't seem to. And so if it doesn't, then we got to do the other thing. And that sort of works, but it doesn't work. It's not a magic thing. Yeah. No, it's other. Probably it's time for another. Yeah, I mean, so Google Scholar, if you even Dudo and us, if you Google Scholar us, all our stuff's up there. And we've been trying to, the tactics paper, we try to publish PLOS ONE so that it's open source. We've increasingly started to think about, I mean, so this is another one of the problems we talked about the trainers, we don't use social science, and they will, well, you publish behind paywalls, and we're not at universities, and so we're trying to get better at, mea culpa, we're trying to get better at doing research that's available to folks. But you guys are, I mean, Anthony's right here on campus with y'all, and I met with his students yesterday. He's got a whole cohort of students who are eager for cool things to do. I will say, though, that as researchers, our gig is not to do your communication for you. Our gig is to try to answer research questions like this or that, right? Does this work or does that work? And if we can figure out the research question underneath it, that's where we have a lot of fun. And then, working with increasingly, so traditionally I've worked with we got into this because we were working directly with scientists. Increasingly, as we think about this, the scientist bit is cool, but the community that needs the most help, I think, right now is the community of communicators who work with scientists. Often former journalists, often people who if journalists don't have training in strategy, right? The whole thing about being a journalist is you're not supposed to be strategic except in telling really good, compelling stories. And so they're not thinking in this way, and so it's a bit of a, and so, they're trying to serve that community of different names, boundary spanners, public information officers, communication staff, engagement staff. It's a fun, increasingly part of our gig. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Oh, do you want? Thank you so much for. Well, hang on. I'm not going anywhere yet.
Yeah, John will stick around for a little bit if anyone wants to chat offline. But thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
Again, thank you very much.